Hey everybody, it's February 11th, Tuesday. You're here at the weekly CHAOSS Community Call. I'm Elizabeth, CHAOSS Community Manager. It's been a while, so thank you to those who facilitated in my stead. I appreciate you very much. You're awesome. I'm assuming that was you, Matt. I don't, actually
Thanks,
didn't
Sean.
double check.
Sean won, me one.
Thank you. Thanks, guys. Yeah, here's the minutes. We'll put them in the chat. Sorry if I have to cough. Oh man, yeah. I will try to mute that because gross, but yeah.
Do you want somebody else to lead the meeting? One of us can do most of the talking if that would be helpful.
That's okay. Thanks, Dawn. Maybe, actually. No, I'll be all right. I'll be all right
If you
till I'm
change
not.
your mind at any point, just shout and somebody else can take over. We got lots of people on this call.
Fair. Thank you. Okay. So the first thing on our agenda, I'm not sure who put this on, but there is a Python Maintainer Summit. Ooh, that looks exciting. Does somebody want to talk about that? If not, we can just go here.
I
I don't know
didn't
what
put
this
it on
is.
there. So
Oh, a CFP. There we go. It's closing pretty soon.
You know what? I put that on there during the scientific open source software meeting the last time. I just wanted to give it a broader promotion. So we got a number of Python folks involved in the project now. So if you're interested in that, it sounds like a really great event, especially if you're relatively new to open source.
Is PyCon in Pittsburgh?
It was last
yeah,
year.
that's what that said at the top.
Okay.
But
They must have some kind of permanent Pittsburgh site or something.
Yeah,
I know nothing about that
that's
detail.
pretty great. It's very hilly. You should go check it out if you've never been.
really pretty. Yeah.
Awesome. Well, thanks, Sean, for sharing that with us. If anybody's interested, check that out. I will jump down here as well because this is also a CFP. It's ending very soon as well. So submit something if you want. Here's how you do that. Here's the tracks and stuff. Same old seems like. Actually kind of surprised they left this in. I'm glad they did. Good for them. Yeah, I don't have any answers if people have questions on that, but I can point you to some information if you do. Just more of a heads up, if you want to submit something, do it sooner than later. And of course, a reminder, like CHAOSScon is happening right after that summit, so it's a good one to go. Go to. Okay, we'll jump back up here. The next, I was just gonna give a quick State of OpenCon recap from a CHAOSS booth standpoint, and then Dawn, if you want to jump in with anything else you have. We had a we had an amazing booth location. We were booth number 2, so everybody had to walk right in front of us, and we were right next to the snacks and the drinks. Like what? So I don't know what magic you pulled, whoever did that, but bless. Thank you so much for that. That was really awesome. We had a lot of great traffic. Also have an observation that whenever we have people who are in CHAOSS giving a talk, that is the optimal situation to have a CHAOSS booth, because so many people come up to you and say, I keep seeing CHAOSS everywhere in this conference. I heard this talk, I heard that talk, whatever, want to know more. So at least there's like they're laying the groundwork for some kind of interaction. It's not just like a random person coming up, what's CHAOSS? Is it chaos engineering? Is it, whatever? Like we get all kinds of questions. So I really love that. I love that when there are CHAOSS talks. And it also gives, I think, the speakers a place to go, to hang out and say, if you want to talk to me more, I'll be at the CHAOSS booth, whatever. So I really like that a lot. And I thought it was a great, even though we didn't do a giveaway, so we don't have any data or anything, intuitively, it felt like a very good experience. Got to meet some folks in CHAOSS in person, and then obviously introduce some new folks to CHAOSS. So if you see some new folks around in various working groups, say hello. They're probably coming from, or they may be coming from State of OpenCon. That's it. That's all I
And the
got.
videos are also live. So those just went up, I think, last night or this morning. And as Elizabeth said, there were quite a few chaos related talks. I did 3 of them myself, which was too many. There was and I posted some of the talks that I did in the general channel a few minutes ago because they were related to the forks and relicensing work. So I did a 5-minute keynote at State of OpenCon on the forks and relicensing, and then we had a panel with James Governor from RedMonk and Stephen Wally from Microsoft. So that was really interesting. We also had a panel about just kind of metrics and data in general. And so that was a talk that Avi Press from SCARF moderated and had Brian Douglas from OpenSauce fame. He's now working at the Linux Foundation. So the Linux Foundation acquired OpenSauce. So I know some of us have been a fan of the work that they've done for quite a while. So I'll be interested to see how he works to improve the LFX data, which is something that he's working on, which is super interesting. But anyways, he was on the panel along with Jen from the OpenUK research team. So she drives most of the reports. So that was another panel that I was on, and Sophia, I think, was also on a panel, and I think that there were other talks from CHAOSS folks there. Ruth, I don't know, Ruth, did you have a talk, or do you know of any other talks that were from some of the chaotics?
Yeah, I think Divya did a talk.
Oh, Divya, yeah, absolutely, and she also co-hosted a track. Yeah, so there's lots of good stuff there. The first day for me had a lot of interesting talks. So kind of future of open source. There was some data talks, some software security talks. The second day was pretty AI heavy, which is less, I guess less my thing. So I didn't watch as many of those, but there are loads of really good talks on AI as well on the second day. And those are all organized in playlists by track. So I would encourage you to have a look at the videos.
Also, shout out to a conference who has somebody on stilts walking around at the social event, which was kind of wild and awesome at the same time. It's just it felt random. Another random fact that I thought was amazing in hindsight, in the restrooms, they had the audio book of Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy just playing. And so, so you go into the restroom and there's a voice, and it was very disorienting. But then after a minute, I was like, wait a minute, this is Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. So props to them. I love it.
It was also I did confirm from another attendee that the same track was in the men's toilets as well.
At first I thought somebody just had accidentally like connected to the speaker or something.
That's
like,
kind
do
of
they
what I
know
thought.
this?
I thought surely this is a mistake and they're gonna fix this, in the next hour or two. But 2
Yeah.
days, I think they had it on repeat because I think we got all the way through it, and I think it's
Yeah.
over. Yeah,
I just kind of wanted to hang out there all day.
good stuff.
It's kind of
Good
nice.
stuff.
So yeah, so shout out. Also, they have vegan food, 100% vegan snacks. So appreciate that. That was awesome. Okay, any final thoughts on State of OpenCon for those who were there?
I did have a question for Don. I couldn't help but pick it up when you were talking about LFX and maybe insights. Like, is this changing to some degree? Because this has always been a kind of a weird issue.
It has. So actually, Callie, maybe you have a little more context on the LFX stuff. I don't know if you want to talk a little bit about that because you've talked more to the team than I have.
What specifically about it?
About whether we're seeing changes. So historically, the LFX data has been very problematic, and historically, the team was not always willing to listen when people told them it was problematic. And so I know that you have had a couple of conversations. So maybe you can just talk a little bit more about what they're doing, some of the changes that they're making.
Yeah, I'd say the interacting with them is completely different than what it used to be. They are very willing to listen to people and seem very genuine in wanting to. If you have a problem, you see a thing, they want to know to be able to improve on it. I do feel like they're like it's just a very different experience. Whether it's actually gotten any better, I don't know. I would assume that it is. Everything that's pointing towards that is that they are working on those things. It would be very interesting to see what the impact of, like, I forgot the person's name that's been working at Open Saucy, because I talked to him for a few minutes at Member Summit, and that was like a week after he got moved over. They were very There was a lot of stuff at Member Summit was them trying to present on how are things working, trying to get user feedback. If they are improving on that feedback, I don't know yet. I'll be curious to see if Sean has anything on that.
Yeah, and just to add to that before we go to Sean, I have a huge amount of respect for Brian Douglas and the Open Source team. So the fact that they are joining the LFX team gives me hope. I guess I'll end it there. Sean, go for it.
I mean, from my perspective, I think where LFX has had trouble is when people go and look at the data and they think it's wrong. LFX, there's no transparency to how they got there. So there could be valid reasons why they're just ingesting the data in a different way. It's that if they can't explain it, then nobody trusts the data, right? So I think I think the most important thing for them to do differently would be to have some transparency, so there can be folks like us, honestly, who critically look at what's there and provide feedback. And I think that would go much farther than anything else to getting that data to be trustworthy.
Yeah,
Kelly.
I would say that even from conversations that I've had in the last few months with them, there were things that, because they were more transparent and were explaining how the values got there, it made sense and it checked out and it was correct, but it wasn't intuitive, like it wasn't interpretable. And so giving them feedback, they were open to being able to explain that, to where I'm like, okay, this is actually technically, this is correct. Like there's not a data and accuracy issue. It is and like helping them say like, okay, here's the information. This is where and why it looks incorrect, and where needs to be some improvements to make it to where the users can understand what they're looking at. And so part of what you're saying, I think, is improving. The one thing that I would say I'm a little bit disappointed by is that I haven't seen them in these calls, because that's something that I really stress to them at all points in this, that I'm like, you have a project in the Linux Foundation that is focused around analyzing open source communities, like with data. You should be like, the best thing that you can do is be actively involved in this community, get the feedback, as you're saying, and being able, like, this exists. And so that's probably been the one downside, is that I haven't seen anybody from their teams here.
Yeah, I think that's all true. The only thing I would add to that is and I think this is still the case, but I haven't had a conversation about it in about a year. But the first thing that a new Augur user does is compare the Augur data to what they can see on the Get Forge. And if it doesn't match, they don't trust it, because Augur's data matches on the very basic things most of the time. People start to trust it and explore it. And I think where LFX fell down was they'd look at LFX, they'd look at GitHub, there was no relationship. And I think the path to credibility is not that long. I just don't know how their data engineering program is. So I don't know how close they are. I'd be happy to talk with them, but wouldn't know where to begin or who to talk to.
I will reach out to Brian Douglas and just ask him if he can maybe encourage someone from the LFX team to show up to some of our meetings and see. Yeah. We can ask again.
Some of this
Brian
isn't
Douglas
rocket science.
involved in, yeah, I guess I haven't seen him around.
I think that Brian Douglas is now leading a big chunk of the team that's responsible for LFX. So we probably don't see him around, but I believe, and I could be wrong, but I believe that he's intimately involved and is managing some of the people who do this work.
Oh yeah, like for on the LF side, I'm saying that on the chaos side, if he's since his move, if he's been involved in chaos.
Not that I've seen.
Yeah.
He is generally a big fan and supportive of the work that we do. I know I've heard him mention the practitioner guides and in a podcast and mentioned chaos metrics. So I suspect it's probably just people are busy.
Yeah.
I will add, just in the past, we folks here in the Chaos Project have spent quite a bit of time trying to foster this relationship with not a whole lot. And so just like caution, like we can reach out, but we have really tried in the past. And if there does seem to be a new path, that's cool. But I just don't want anybody to take a whole ton of time if we just end up in the same spot.
Yeah, I had given up talking to them
Yeah.
at all.
That's why
As-
I am going the angle of like really pushing them to start coming to chaos, like being engaged in like there are spaces like they bring things up and I'm like, oh, you can go to the chaos data science working group for this. You can go to these working groups for this. Like the conversations and the feedback that they want already exist in a lot of channels that exist within chaos. And so with the lack of return that has come over the years, I think it's more than fair to push. And it's also just like if you like this community exists for a reason. If like them being a part of it and those conversations happening in the open benefits everybody a lot more than if they're happening on an email thread between two people. Um, so that's kind of been my strategy is to really try to push people to come here because all of the questions that I have received from them, there has been a place and an avenue to have those conversations that are and that already exist in chaos.
I mean, if the LFX team would adopt chaos metrics and listen, just kind of work with us a little bit on the data engineering side, I mean, they could do it would be great. I mean, I think every LF member would love it. Every LF member would love it. It would reduce our software costs on this project substantially. I mean, it'd be a win across the board. But so Don, if you've got a way to facilitate those conversations, I think we're good. We would love it.
I
It's
can
good for
encourage
chaos, in
them
my
to come
opinion.
talk to us. That's probably about all I can do.
And I think to protect protect all of our own times, that's yeah. It'll be interesting to see what happens at this upcoming members summit, especially since there's such a short turnaround between the two. Of they were really pushing like publicly of like feedback, a transparency, wanting to work with people, and so now there's been time, and to see if any of that's been acted on and also being able whenever I'm sure that at least with me I'm going to have conversations like, oh, did you look at this, and I'm going to be like, did you start having like try to talk about doing whenever it comes to data science stuff, did you start engaging in the data science working group, why haven't y'all been doing that, and seeing if yeah, see, let's see, I'm curious to see what happens. I'll put that.
That would be great. And I like if they want feedback, like the encouragement to have them come here, because that has happened in the past. We were given like a bunch of interfaces to give feedback on. And we're like, no.
And like there's a software working group where you can say on the agenda, want to do a demo and walk through like that.
Yeah, it's just
Space
sitting
is
right
there.
there.
People are
I
ready to
mean,
engage in
Yep.
and I can't emphasize. I mean, I don't know. I'm repeating myself now. I can't emphasize enough how much they would accomplish if they simply looked at their data and compared it to GitHub to make sure it's the same before they shared information or shared a UI. Because I've seen the faces of dozens of open source people drop when they look at the dashboard and the data doesn't look anything like the data they know it to be. So they could fix that. I think we could help them fix that because we've been dealing with that data for 7-8 years now. But so I guess there's a willingness to help.
Okay, good conversation. We'll see what happens. Okay, any final thoughts on that before we move on? Okay, looks like FOSDEM videos are also live, so go check those out. Some good talks there.
There was also lots of really good stuff from Chaotix there. So in the research room, open research and data, I think was what it was called. Sophia gave a talk, Daniel Katz gave a talk. There was lots of good stuff there. I did a main room track on forks and relicensing if people aren't tired of hearing me talk about that. And then there was also there were some really good talks. I attended the funding dev room, and Georg, Johan Lineker, and Kevin Lombard talked about the data that they've gathered from maintainers about funding and when it helps and when it doesn't. And that talk was really interesting. I would encourage people to have a watch of that one. I don't know, Sean, anybody else? Ruth saw any really interesting talks? Callie?
I saw some great talks on in the scientific space about climate change and TLDR were doomed. Those were actually pretty good. There were some other good talks in that room. That's the room that I spent most of my day in on Saturday.
I'll be honest, it was my first FOSDEM and I was overwhelmed.
Yeah,
And so I didn't make it to much time.
I spent almost the entirety of Saturday in the GCC dev room. There's so much exciting stuff happening in that project, and I am extremely looking forward to a lot of the things that they're working on. So that was a lot of fun. Particularly, there's a lot of work going on with COBOL. The GCC front end for COBOL is evolving very rapidly, which in 2025, I mean, is there anything else we should be doing?
Yeah, that's super interesting.
And I spent my Saturday in the community room, of course, and also saw some great talks, community building and things like that. I don't think there were any chaotics. I think Brian was scheduled to speak on accessibility, but I don't think he was able to get a visa, so they had to slot somebody else real quick. But yeah, it was good. It is, Callie, extremely overwhelming. It feels like it gets worse every year. Every year. It's just a lot. At least the weather was nice and sunny, so we didn't have to deal with the snow and whatnot. But yeah, you're not alone, Callie. I think that's the word that everyone says. Like, it's great also.
I mentioned this last week on the call, and I was the only participant who was here, that it was back to pre-pandemic attendance levels. Like the food truck lines were as long as 2019 again. Like, so it was, if this was your first one, Callie, this was like the mega FOSDEM Woodstock experience. You really got the full.
It felt like it. Oh, I will say I did see one good talk, or like it was the only talk that I went to, but in the main track there was an interesting like women and like the history of women in technology, like going through different people that have done major, like women who've done major research and other points. It was a really cool talk to see.
Oh yeah, there was another one in the main track that I really liked. James Bottomley did a talk about the selfish contributor, and it was all about kind of tapping into people's motivations and how to make that work for projects. And that talk was really interesting. And James is just a super smart guy, so he talked about it in ways. So I've been doing this for a really, really long time, and he talked about it in ways that I hadn't really framed it in ways I hadn't really thought of before. So that I found really, really interesting. Had kind of a different take than what you hear in a lot of talks.
I like the idea. I think there's a lot of villainization of people's interests that come into it versus like just wanting to like just meet where everyone's at and what their motivations are. You can get a lot farther if you try to figure out what the mutual motivate, like where people can mutually get things that they need out of a project or their experience. It's a lot better than trying to, I think like the I think the student persona gets villainized a lot, versus understanding why they're coming to the table and how people can be benefited from it and things like that. I have a lot of
Yeah,
fun.
he talked a lot about the like the passive aggressiveness that happens in communities and the ways that people try to manipulate each other, which is something that I had always kind of thought of as the, you know, the vocal minority. So that one person who's talking about something and wants to make it sound like that's what everybody thinks, and it really isn't. But he talked about this and framed it in more of a, you know, passive aggressive manipulation mindset that some people have, and so that was really interesting.
Yeah, that sounds super interesting. I'm gonna have to go watch that. I missed that, but that's my jam. I love that stuff. That's awesome. Anybody else have any recommendations of things they saw they want to share? Okay.
I
Let's
actually
move-
did have one last thing. The
No, go ahead,
Python
John.
dev room was something that I had really wanted to attend. Unfortunately, the line for it was basically constantly long. At one point, it actually stretched out of the building and around the side near to where the food trucks were. And it was in building UB, I think. So that was impressive. But there was one particular talk I thought was very cool, using Python as your init system. Because I didn't know this, but apparently you can just use any random process as init. The kernel will just run it at process 0. You just have to link it to /bin/init, and the kernel will run it on startup. And you can do that with the Python interpreter. So that was a pretty cool talk.
Awesome. We'll check that out as well on the schedule. Okay, let's go on to our new working group we have starting this week, starting tomorrow. Yay. Dawn, do you want to talk a little bit about it?
Yeah, so this working group came out of an idea that Kalen Osborne had. So he works at the Linux Foundation and also is kind of their primary interface into NGI, which is an EU funding organization, and they have a segment of their funding goes to open source projects. Along with Paul Sherratt, who's at the Sovereign Tech Agency, previously known, they manage the Sovereign Tech Fund. And so the three of us, along with Mirko Bohm from the Linux Foundation, had been working on some papers and presentations about funding, and we thought that it would be good to bring that into CHAOSS, but focused specifically on measuring the impact that funding has. Because you know, so if you watch the FOSDEM talk from Georg, Kevin, and Johan, you know, their funding doesn't always help. Like the funding can have a positive impact on projects. It actually, in some cases, has had negative impacts on projects. And every project is different. Every funding organization, like the, you know, Sovereign Tech Agency, focuses mostly on core infrastructure projects and maintenance of those projects. And so how you would measure that is very different than an organization that's funding, say, new projects or new features in projects. And so there's a whole bunch of stuff around funding that's really nuanced and is quite difficult. And so we're trying to get people thinking about it and maybe start building out maybe some, you know, some tooling that helps people do that, or, you know, something that helps people work through these issues. Because there is no magic solution. We're not gonna, you know, meet for 3 weeks and then be like, this is how you measure the impact of funding. But we can get all of these people from the corporate side who are funding stuff out of OSPOs, like Emma Irwin at Microsoft, you know, talking to some of these other people who are funding out of, you know, governmental or NGO organizations. And so I think it'll be really interesting to get a bunch of people talking about and sharing best practices for how they measure the impact of their funding, because it's a super complex topic. I don't know, Sean, if you want to add anything to that, because I know this is a conversation you've had a lot in the scientific and research space.
Yes. I don't really have anything to add right now. I've added enough to this meeting already. I mean, I think there are some different considerations that the Sovereign Tech Fund specifically has that are, I think, adjacent to the scientific open source funding problem space. But I think the trick is there's a particular cyclicalness to scientific open source that I'll be curious to understand if that exists as well for Sovereign Tech Fund folks, or folks that are applying for funding from there or who get funding from there. Because if you're not corporately tied, my experience with the scientific folks is you do have these like months or years long gaps where the software doesn't appear to evolve. And in a corporate sense, that would mean it's dead. But in the scientific space, that just means they're between funding cycles, especially in the United States. And in Europe, they have, I could just go on about this forever. In Europe, they have this greater degree of professionalization of the research software engineers. So European open source scientific projects sometimes have less of this lag.
Matt.
Don, if in this group, whoever's there, if you could put something together that could be sent out to other folks that might be interested in joining, like some text that I could potentially use to reach out, say, to somebody at Sloan or CZI or Welcome or Siegel Foundation, whoever it might be that might have an interest, just to kind of scope out, what it is that you're doing, that'd be really helpful for me. You have
Yeah, have a look at the GitHub repository, because that's the README is where we put some of the context and some of the objectives. And if that doesn't give you enough, just reach out in the working group channel
all right,
and
I'll
we
take a
can
look
put
at that.
together.
Okay,
We can
cool.
put together. So it's got some activities and some different things. But this first meeting, I think, will be really interesting because the agenda for it is basically to talk through those things, to talk about kind of where this came from, the objectives, and talk about where we start. So what are the first things that we want to work on, and how do we do that? So I think this first meeting will be really interesting.
Okay, cool. I think that link will probably be pretty good. I will give it a read, but that's something. And I assume like invite away, right? Like,
Yeah.
okay.
Yeah, totally. I mean, I think the thing that's important for this working group for people to understand, which you do, but when you're communicating this, it's not a place where people go to get funding. Like it's not necessarily the projects that are being funded. It's not necessarily even all of the funders. But it's really laser focused on the things that CHAOSS cares about. So we have the same conversations in the UN SDG working group. It's really focused on how do we measure the impact of this funding. And so it is, as much as we can, we want to keep it laser focused on the impact, as opposed to all of the other things that we could talk about when it comes to funding.
Okay. There was, just for what it's worth, there was a Dario Taraborelli came to the university working group last week and kind of gave some insights on that from CZI's perspective.
Awesome.
And like, so I don't know that like there might be people like within these organizations, not necessarily the folks that I know, but that might have the time and the interest to talk about this.
Yeah, absolutely. Because that's what I'm thinking. Like, it might not be the people who are, it might not even be the people who are making the decisions and giving out the funding, like those, individuals.
Yeah.
But somebody has to measure the impact of this, or it gets hard to continue to provide funding for things, right? Like if somebody provides funding and, especially some of these NGO organizations that are funded by, by governments and things, like the Sovereign Tech Agency is funded by the German government. NGI is funded by the EU Commission. And if they can't demonstrate eventually that the money that they're being given from these organizations has some sort of impact, then it's
Yeah.
going to be really, really hard to continue to do this work. And so this is why we want to focus on it now. Is like now we have, we have enough projects that have been funded that we can start figuring out how we look at the impact and make sure that we can communicate that so that we can continue to fund these funding initiatives. Sean, sorry, you've got your hand up.
I would just add, Dario talked to the academic open source group was it last week or maybe the week before, whenever they last met. And a point he made, which is a point I've heard him made in making talks like for the last 3 years, is that there needs to be an investment in qualitative research in this space, because so much of what we're trying to sort is you've got to have more context than just the data to understand the impact. And in science, we know it's like a 2 to 3 year post funding time where you're going to see the scientific results. It might be different for what the Sovereign Tech Fund funds, but teasing all of that out, it's just, we can't get a bunch of electronic trace data and draw conclusions from that. There is and we see this with the work we do in Augur, there is a substantial amount of qualitative work that happens when we're familiar with the projects and talking to the maintainers routinely, like we do here in CHAOSS. It's easier to sort it out. But for some of these Sovereign Tech Fund projects, it may be similar to the scientific case where there isn't really one place to go to understand those projects. And it probably requires a more deliberate effort to get the qualitative data, which explains all the context of what you're seeing in Augur or Grimoire Lab.
Yeah, absolutely. So that was exactly the point that Kaylin, Paul, Mirko, and I made in the OFA paper, was that you can't just look at trace data. You really have to do both. You can look at trace data, but you also have to actually talk to these people. And so you really have to use these kind of mixed methods approaches where you look at both. And that's going to be, I think really, really important. And, that I think was one of the takeaways for the research that Georg, Johan, and Kevin have been working on, where they went out and they interviewed a whole bunch of maintainers and asked them questions about funding. And it's really interesting research. There's a paper about it, and you can watch the video from FOSDEM. But that was exactly the point that they made, was you really need to talk to these people, because what you think the impact might be isn't always what the impact was. And money changes things with people. Like money is hard. People get weird about money. And when you start giving money to projects and they aren't ready for it, don't know what to do with it, who gets paid and who doesn't, it causes real conflict in some of these projects. And it's important to think about.
Yeah, I've seen things get funded not enough to actually solve the problem, which leads to stress across the board.
Okay, any final thoughts or questions about this new working group? Okay. Join us tomorrow if you want to be a part of that. Final on the agenda is AI in the CHAOSS project.
Yeah, we should be able to solve this in 7 minutes. So that's all. And so I had just spent the weekend at Dawn. I was at that social science food camp, and which is a lot of fun. I met Tim O'Reilly, for what it's worth. So in an elevator. But just the question here is, it's not even about like the note takers, but like, is this something that we should be thinking about how to incorporate realistically into the CHAOSS project, like to help us write metrics, practitioner guides? I'm just thinking out loud here, like, would this be something that we would ever want to consider to help kind of produce some of the things that we produce?
Like the AI note takers?
No. This was not about the AI note takers. So
Okay.
this was more about like using AI to help us produce some of the artifacts that we produce in the project. I'm just thinking out loud. I'm not saying I'm for it or against it, but like using AI to help build metrics or metric models or practitioner guides. is there a way to do that? Like, you know, I don't know. Yeah, Callie.
When it comes to like the conceptual side of things, I think that's pretty difficult, especially with like the visualizations and metrics. Like, I just think there's usually more context that's necessary than what can be given, at least by AI now. But whenever it comes to like, should we be considering how it could be supportive in writing documentation? Like, that's something that like once the concept is built out, I think that's something that I'd be more interested in talking about. I'm just honestly not that familiar nor have worked with this stuff enough to know how good the documentation that's being generated by AI is. But that would be the side of it that I'd be more interested in, like than the conceptual, like the building of coming up with a metric, coming up with the concept of a practitioner guide. But instead of like once that structure and that concept is there, how we get all of the text that goes along with it that provide like that does like the more in-depth documentation, that's something that's interesting to me.
Cool.
Well, I think the place to start would be to have somebody to try to use an AI to actually build something and have them report on it or illustrate the results. It could prove pretty useful. It could prove distracting. I don't know.
Yeah, John.
So in terms of using generative AI for things like, I think I heard documentation was one sort of avenue, or metrics. I think it can definitely be very useful. It is, I think that the modern renditions of generative AI are more often helpful than not, especially compared to the earlier ones, like the early GPT-3 and GPT 3.5 demos. But I think that the number of concerns with intellectual property rights is sort of ever increasing, especially considering that basically all public code on the planet has been scraped at this point by some AI bots to provide training data. So that's one place where I think extra care would need to be taken for any code generated by the AI, especially. But also, as with almost any of these services, at least, there's also the cost aspect, both monetary costs. So if you're using a hosted service, and of course you have to pay to use the APIs in order to produce the generations, but also on top of that, the environmental impact that generative AI has. So if we're talking about using something like a larger LLM or transformer model for things like this, I would say that special care would probably need to be taken to ensure that sort of ecological sustainability is taken into account. And that's my
Yeah,
whole
the latter
spiel.
point certainly came up. The impact, environmental impact point certainly came up over the weekend. This was just really one of the first like meetings I was at where less about just like software development, but kind of like communities like this and people now being a little bit more like, how do we get out in front of this as opposed to like, what's this going to do to us? That it was a little bit more, the conversation was more proactive. And so that's why I brought it here, as opposed to just kind of letting it play out, like be part of that process, because it certainly is coming. And obviously we don't have any answers here. But I'd kind of like to keep this conversation a little bit at the forefront in some way, because it may prove beneficial in some spots in the CHAOSS project. And it might be worth trying to figure out what those spots are and what the cost benefit can be.
So Matt, if I'm understanding you, kind of you're envisioning this just kind of being a recurring topic. There's no real action item for anybody, just kind of everybody thinking about if, how, why we would incorporate
Yeah.
facets of AI into.
And like we
Okay.
think about like embracing that as opposed to being like, we need to, as opposed to saying
Yeah.
we shouldn't do that. But if there are people, I think Ruth put something in there and I haven't read it all, but really kind of embracing it and looking at it as a positive step. Again, just thinking out loud. This is from the conversation at that food camp that I was at.
Yeah. Yeah, I definitely think it's something we should talk about. I know it's come up a couple of times, but we haven't really made a concerted effort to, focus any true conversations around it. Ruth put in the chat thinking if we should look at the open source AI definition. I think that's super interesting as well, especially as it pertains to metrics. I also think that it would be interesting to see how AI could be used in some of our metrics, meaning some of our metrics that like I know, Sean, you were working on a project to like get the tone of a community, like to red flag some terms and things like that. Like that might be something that CHAOSS could consider or think about how those LLMs can inform some of our metrics. I don't know.
Yeah, we basically used AI back when it was called unsupervised machine learning. So,
But yeah, that's just a thought. Okay, we are actually out of time. So thank you everybody for showing up today. Appreciate you being here. Sorry if I was coughing in your face. I love you all. I missed you. I'm glad to be back. And I'll see you all later. Have a great rest of your
Wait,
week.
wait,
Bye,
before we
everybody.
end, do we have a CHAOSScon committee meeting after this? Or are we just gonna skip this one and regroup in a couple of weeks after we've recovered from all the travel?
I vote we.
Yeah. I'm not going to be in a meeting. I have another meeting at noon, in 9 minutes, my time. So
Yeah, no, I think
Yeah.
that's fair. We've got loads of time. We
okay.
can get the survey in from the last one before we.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, I
Okay.
just wanted to get that in before someone hit the leave button that kicks us all out.
Thank you for that, Dawn. See y'all later. Bye.
Bye, everybody.
Bye, everyone.